Yeah, so we're recording now. So, 10-hour OSHA. Any idea why we're doing this at ERS? Is it required?
Yes.
Why?
Rules, regulations, as far as anything as far as safety, performance.
Yeah, the 10 and 30 hour are both part of what OSHA calls an outreach program, outreach training. And so under that umbrella, it's not required by OSHA. It is, something they encourage. And obviously, if you're a VPP site or intending to get VPP status, then it is to a company or site's benefit that they're going somewhat beyond the minimum requirements of OSHA regs. So that's kind of where this falls in. It's really a ES commitment because of things that happened and our desire to, I guess, improve our safety culture. So that's why we're in today. So it is essentially for ERS. It's an all hands requirement. And so, yeah, you got a folder there, and it has an agenda in it for the next 3 days, and note taking info. You guys are my penny gigs. I've not done this before, so well, welcome to the show, Barnum and how did that get changed? Did I change that? I'm okay. You're gonna have to. Is there an on button? Yeah, there's an on button on this. Okay. Now we're going, I think. All right. Anyway, so that sign that was on that poster that was on there before, did anybody recognize that? It's posted in the break room. It's required OSHA poster. But here's, in this particular lesson, what we're going to do is just, introductory of OSHA, about OSHA, why it's important, rights and responsibilities that are both employee and employers, mainly employers, but talk some about OSHA standards, inspections, resources that can help for questions and whatnot. So, and if anybody has any questions or comments as we go through this, please let me know. And so 8:30 we'll go, I don't know what, about an hour or so, I guess, and take a final break and see how it goes. So before we get started with that, little levity. So everybody knows what an antonym is, right? What's an antonym? What's a synonym? Synonym is a word that means, different word that means similar, similar meaning. Antonym is opposite. Have you ever heard of a morphonym? Probably not, because I invented it. A morphonym is you change one letter in a word and then you redefine it. So one of my favorites is taking reincarnation and morphing it into reincarnation. So can anybody guess what reincarnation means? Coming back to life as a resident of North Carolina. Go Eagles. All right. Look at the, here we go. So, why is OSHA important to you? And think about, okay, I graduated from high school in 1971. The basic OSHA reg was written in 1970. I mean, just in terms of context, was anybody else in the room born besides me in 1970? Oh, you were? Sorry. So it's been around for a while. As you can see on this one, they're using 2013 data. The stats usually lag a couple 3 years to get completed, but so they're saying 12 workers die every day. They pulled out 797 Hispanic Latinos killed 2013, 3 million serious workplace injuries and illnesses in 2012. Worker deaths down from 38 to 12. That's per day, right? Yeah, a day. Down from 10.9 to 3.0. Now, obviously, this is kind of taking credit for that. Some of that would have happened whether or not we had OSHA. And honestly, I mean, this is an OSHA course, but let's face it, health and safety are good business. It's a good business practice. I mean, you have people that are trained to do a job, and most of you are somewhat new here, and just the added cost for people coming and going, irrespective of how it occurs, is considerable. So stability and healthy workforce is something all employers desire. Yeah, so there's actually a video on YouTube about the signing ceremony for the OSHA rule, and I think you know what OSHA stands for. It carves out, worker health and safety. What would be a different federal organization that has somewhat of an overlap with OSHA, but kind of maybe a little bit different, especially in the realm of, let's say, chemicals. NIOSH is a research arm, really that was established in the OSHA Act. Other federal agencies that deal with things, health-related things. EPA, the difference being in a risk assessment sense is EPA's charged with everybody all the time. and makes a significant difference in risk assessment because you're looking at sensitive subpopulations, which is generally children and elderly. As compared to OSHA, there's kind of a presumption, and I don't know that we'll get this deep into any of the risk assessment components of it, but there's a certain presumption, and that is that you're healthy enough, you're an adult, and you're healthy enough to be at work. So if you had COPD or emphysema or whatever, I mean, there's a lot of things that probably would carve you out of being considered in the workforce. Tricky Dick was the president who signed the act in 1970, and it came to being on April 28th, 1971. Like I said, I graduated from high school in June of '71. So, frankly, my professional career in environmental health and so forth has been kind of somewhat guided by fortunate timing. Mission: ensure safe and healthy work conditions for working men and women. Standards, training, outreach, this is part of that. Education and assistance. So developing job safety and health standards and enforcing them through inspections, and then training folks both, and this would be one instance of it. There's an organization called the OSHA Training Institute, which provides courses, a little more in-depth courses. Frankly, one of the reasons I'm doing this now, and a lot of my peers, is that right after the act was passed, and by the way, EPA was created in 1971. So all those things were coming to be at the same time. There really weren't enough practitioners to fill the need in industry, government, commercial, etc. So I actually enlisted in the Army in 1972 as an environmental health technician, and within a year I was at East Tennessee State getting a bachelor's in environmental health. And there's a ton of other people who about that same time were entering the bachelor's program or graduate school. There was a lot of money thrown at educational institutions in the first decade or so that of OSHA and EPA. And by the way, so how old am I? 63. So there's a big bolus of folks that practice environmental health and safety, environmental engineering, and so forth, that are on the threshold of retirement. So the opportunities are immense right now, just because of that fact of the, we're essentially 46, so we're a career from the enabling legislation. So I'll kind of try to fill in some of these, I don't know. I'm not just going to read these slides to you, try to give you a little ground on some of this. So, what are your rights? And this occupational health and safety, I guess, in the U.S. is quite a bit different than it is in other countries. For example, I'll just point out a few. I mean, I probably talk on that all day, but so in Canada, for example, workers are actually responsible through the legislation, and OSHA, or the Canadian OSHA can actually fine an employee for not following work instructions. That doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen in the US. It's all employer's responsibility in terms from a legal perspective. So health and safe and healthful workplace. We'll touch on that in the Enabling Act, in the OSHA Act, here before too long. Know the right to know about hazardous chemicals and really other hazards in the workplace as well. Report injuries to the employer. Complain or request hazard correction from employers. So there's a complaint mechanism, and interestingly, and I'm not sure why this is, but OSHA is the federal and state entity that receives the portal for complaints to just about every type of legislation. So if you have a federal complaint on Wall Street about a SEC, Stock Exchange, Security Exchange Commission, it goes to OSHA and then to the SEC. There's kind of a little factoid. Training, exposure and medical records. Some of these we'll touch on a little more in this course, and then some in some of the other things on the agenda. File complaint, I think that was already with OSHA compared to your employer. Participate in inspection processes and be free from retaliation. Yeah, okay. So this is in your handout, and it was that first, let's see, it's not in the slides part, it's in that, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's in that one that has nothing, it's in that. Yeah, it has the handouts in it. So that is a thing that is required to be posted. It is in that exact thing is in our in the break room, and it kind of goes over mainly the rights that you have under the law. Some of the ones that were on that previous slide actually were in there. So is that new to anybody? So we're going to go through a few of those. So safe and healthful workplace, the Act, it shows there. And if you want to look at the Act, it's on their website, OSHA Act, and provided workers with the right to a safe and healthful workplace. The duty is on employers to provide a healthful workplace free of known dangers that could harm people. That is that particular phrase is almost verbatim out of the Act, and it's called the General Duty Clause. And so there's a lot of hazards that don't have standards per se in OSHA regs. And for that, let's say, for example, I think we're going to study ergonomics, right? So ergonomics is one that there is no specific standard for ergonomics. And so the regulatory, I guess, hook goes back to the General Duty Clause in the basic legislation. So if it's known, scientifically known, then the employer is obligated to, as a general duty, to know it and control it. And rights to participate in activities like were mentioned again on that previous slide. Okay, another one, like, has everybody had a HASCOM class from me in here? I did one, I guess the first one was in conjunction with our first, HASCOM, stop and think. I did one that first 2015 when we had the stop and think stand down day. And then we've done some others for making. And let me kind of maybe step back for a second and say, okay, so 1970 was the law, when the law was passed, and then standards started being developed. Anybody got an idea of what existed prior to 1970? So there weren't there wasn't anything available prior to 1970. There was, in fact, one of the things I guess most of you kind of come in contact with on safety data sheets through HASCOM is ACGIH. Anybody know what that stands for? Threshold limit values. American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. They produce exposure limits for physical, chemical, and I was going to say biological, I'm not sure about that, agents. They're non-regulatory, but the first TLV book came out in 1968. There was a committee of the American Public Health Association that goes back to post-World War II that used to encourage things like, of course, companies had their own standards. For example, you guys know I came from Eastman, and Eastman actually has 30 some odd exposure limits that are company generated because they're kind of the sole producer of certain chemicals. And so those exist in the company and are transmitted to customers, even though it's not available per se in any kind of formal regulatory setting items. So prior to 1984, which was the first HASCOM rule, things existed. There were ANSI standards. The then was called the Chemical Manufacturers Association, had guidelines that member companies used. So it's not like nothing existed. In fact, most of the original OSHA standards, and many of them that are still in play today, were adopted standards from ANSI and other consensus standard setting bodies. So information about injuries and illnesses. We post the 300 log each year from I think it's the end of January to somewhere around tax day of previous year. Out on the bulletin board, of course, other information is available to anybody through OSHA websites or TOSHA in our case that have additional information about injuries and so forth. complaints. You have the right to bring up concerns to your employer. And obviously that's something that we not only expect, but we encourage here through whatever mechanism you want to. Obviously the suggestion cards are one, but there's things that happen on an ad hoc basis between employee to employee and employee to supervisor and so forth. There are rules, OSHA rules that protect employees from retaliation against reporting of violations, and we'll go over those a little bit. Training. Obviously, there's some things that employers are obligated to do, and examples of that, of training that we as a company are required to do to be in compliance. Anybody in a course this afternoon at 2 o'clock? What is that? Lockout, tagout. So there's specific things that are, if that thing exists within your workplace, that you're required to take. There are a lot of things that are required training that, because that risk is not here at this plant, we don't take. I guess a biggie, again, I'll kind of draw from my personal experience at Eastman, the process safety management rule, which is 1910-119, only applies to the chemical industry, essentially. You have to have large volumes of chemicals, but it's mainly manufacturing, chemical manufacturing. And in there's a multitude of training requirements. Because we don't manufacture chemicals, it doesn't apply to us. So other ones, there's a lot of what we call 6B rules. That's out of the OSHA Act. So things like asbestos, benzene, methylene chloride, most of them are carcinogens or reproductive hazards that, if you have it and use it, then you have to train on it. It includes some of them there that we are for and are doing. I'm trying to make sure I'm keeping these things in sync so the recording works correctly. So here's one that's also included on that OSHA poster, 1910-1020, and it's about exposure and medical records. And it says you have the right to look at or have a copy of your exposure or medical records any time in your employment or even after employment from a company. So anyway, I don't know, did anybody not know that?
After employment?
Yes.
Can you look at them, or can I give you a copy of them?
They don't have to give you a copy of them, but they have to allow you to copy it yourself or a representative. I tell you, I've had very few instances where this has occurred, and I've always had responsibility for these records, especially from the exposure side. But it is an obligation for employers to inform you where they are and what the mechanism is to get them. So So for example, if you asked me today, it would be at Dr. Fernando's office, maybe at work care. They're somewhat duplicative, but there may be some, you know, in the sense of being transparent, I'd have to say check both, because there may be something at work care that's not in Fernando and vice versa. And the exposure records would be those that we have internally. Of course, the major ones we have are your dosimetry records. Any other questions on that one? Good question. File a complaint. And this is talking about, notice that word down there, imminent danger. Yeah, so you can go to the agency, and in our case it would be OSHA, since they have primacy within the state, and you know, if you don't think something's being looked at or controlled appropriately, then there is an avenue that you can maintain anonymity and make that known through the regulators. That's true at state or federal level, whichever applies. And the right to participate in that inspection. Of course, some of this is a little more skating on the lines of when you have unions, and you know, you have employees represented by an organization, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So, you know, you can ask to talk to an inspector privately. That obviously happens if they're here. That they will talk to you. I mean, generally, they'll talk to employees without supervision or management around to, you know, to try to get at the root cause of whatever they're here for. And so if a company is cited, then the results of that action are also posted. We had the citations from the fall in 2014 were posted on this bulletin board right here for quite a long time. I think a year or something of that nature. Free from retaliation. Again, it's in the Basic Act. One thing to remember is that 30 days is almost, I personally think it's sort of ridiculous that there's a 30-day window, especially with some of the health concerns that you know, take years to develop, but they really expect the complaint to be 30 days, within 30 days.
So, do you have any leeway? So, if you were to go through, say, the Sound Whistle program and Energy Solutions,
Mm-hmm.
they push you out for 3 weeks. Have you not voted your ability to go to OSHA?
No, you know, they can, obviously they can waive that, and you can appeal a decision that is arbitrarily because of a time frame, and you know, you would have to lay out your case there. Can they? If you, let's say you were in a internal investigation through Silent Whistle for 45 days, I think they would really consider that as the beginning of the reporting period, and would, you know, that would be kind of de facto starting that process as well, because you've reported it to the employer, and I think they would you know, if it then didn't get resolved, that reporting it to them, they would see it as if you had reported to them originally.
So less reputable companies can just push you off past the reporting limit.
No. I say no, you know, these are all things that are, you know, have people in them, and, you know, all of government has, you know, supporters and, you know, interests. I don't want to be a naysayer, but, you know, a realist.
I worked at a place that used benzene all the time. And they didn't produce it, but they used it.
Used it.
But we never had any training on it. A lot of the, I remember a lot of containers never even had a label or nothing on them for a long time.
For real.
When I first started working there until I seen it. And then, but later on, if you had some kind of problem, reproductive problem or something, could you prove that, or would that be something illegal you have to go through, I guess?
Well, it depends on what your desire is. I mean, obviously, and do you mind me asking who and what?
At the tire plant when I worked up there.
Okay.
Benzene is what they use to take rubber apart. Rubber sticks together.
Uh-huh.
That's the only thing that gets it apart.
Okay.
And you had it on your hands every day. I mean, you used it constantly. You had a bucket sitting there with benzene in it, and that you used it. And I never was told anything. We had no kind of training on it. And like I said, when I first started, there was just 50-gallon drums of it. Didn't have any labels or nothing. And then later on, they started putting labels on it that had the dangers and everything. But I told another guy about that. I was like, you know, when I first started, I didn't know anything about it. And
Yeah.
still, the containers where you worked at had nothing. They were just red containers full of benzene.
Yeah, so that's, I'm assuming this is fairly recently, given your age. So, yeah, those are very inappropriate activities. I mean, if benzene is one of those 6B rule chemicals that I mentioned earlier. It's a carcinogen. Actually, the guy who wrote, Don Witt, who wrote the OSHA HAZCOM rule originally, was a bench chemist that had benzene exposure. He developed leukemia and survived it, and you know, so he had personal experience with it.
Yeah, I didn't think much about it until I started reading on that label all the stuff that it could cause, nerve damage, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And I was like, I was in that every day.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people are still in it every day. I don't know if they had any training on it or not, because we didn't at that time. So.
Yeah, benzene's one of the ones well established to be a known human carcinogen, and so has its own specific rules that has exposure limits and requires periodic monitoring to establish what the exposure is, and controls, obviously, and so forth. So yeah, that was a direct and obvious violation.
That's been over 20 years ago, so I worked out there.
Yeah, still, you're talking 1990. The first HAZCOM standard was 1984. So, and the knowledge that benzene is a carcinogen, I'm virtually certain pre-existed OSHA by decades. That's a classic, like asbestos, benzene, asbestos, arsenic. You know, there's a lot of classical things that for a long time. Yeah, so like we were looking at medical records and exposure records. So, I mean, you have the right to ask that previous employer to give you whatever records they have. Employer, Okay, and again, the majority of the obligations, I guess all of them actually, almost all of them are on the employer in the U.S. I can't think of any that are on the employee per se through OSHA reg. Free from recognized hazards. That can be an interesting conversation about what is a recognized hazard. It's not as clear cut as you might think. Some things it is, obviously, like benzene, asbestos, and so forth. Here's one to throw out there as I have a personal opinion about it. Styrene. It is ubiquitous in industry, highly used in large quantities, very distinct odor. If you've ever been around styrene, you know it. And it is a suspect carcinogen, a 2B, IARC-2B, which means that it is it's been determined to cause cancer in animals, but there's no direct human evidence. As much as styrene is used in our society, I personally am convinced that it is not a human carcinogen because it's used so much. If it was, science would be able to demonstrate it. That's my opinion. There aren't too many like that are, used in the quantities that styrene are. Yeah, so I think we've covered most of that. Training, we're required to keep records of injuries and illnesses, give medical exams for certain things based on your exposures. Here, what? I just had my physical, so I mean, a big part of that's because we wear respirators. I'm not sure we have, of course, we get audiometric exams, although we're not really in the hearing conservation program here, so we don't exceed the exposure limit. I don't know, there's a lot of things that really are gleaned from those that are a requirement other than the respiratory protection standard. Anybody think differently? Yeah, pay for PPE. Additional reporting and record keeping checklists. Okay, so these are the basics that are in 1904 rule. And I say that stuff, when I say that stuff, Code of Federal Regulations, 29 is labor, NRC is 10, right, Justin? 10? Huh? CFR?
Yeah.
10 CFR is NRC, so 1910, or 29 CFR is Department of Labor, 1910 is OSHA General Industry. So, I know I kind of throw those things out like everybody knows what I'm talking about, but that's what I'm referring to when I do that. Illicit injury records. Yeah, so posting of the OSHA log, and then your records available to workers and OSHA, and then that annual summary, again, that is posted every year. And those are the requirements. Obviously, if you are want something else that's not a requirement, we are transparent and will try to get you whatever. I mean, like you mentioned about AA, I mean, that's my responsibility to go research that and give you feedback. Although, if you guys were working with any carcinogen, I mean, I personally would have an obligation to make you aware of that. And so that's part of why I was looking at that as well. Yeah, so, and I'm not sure why they set up the standards like this. A lot of them are the same, but of course we fall under general industry for the majority of the time. It's not really what you're classified as a company. You can go into the construction standard. For example, if we build a warehouse here on site, which has been planned for a while, that activity, the construction of that warehouse, the rules will fall under, the activity falls under the construction standard, and therefore you'd go under 1926, not 1910. I mean, obviously the maritime and agriculture, we don't deal with very much. I've never dealt with them, to tell you the truth. Standards limit the amount of chemicals, substance, noise. So it's chemicals and physical agents. There's not really one for bio. I mean, a specific standard that would have to go back to the general duty clause. But and then they require safe work practices, and again, require the employer to keep certain records and to make a risk, an exposure assessment on the front end, and then to manage change in their operation. Most frequently cited standards. Does he have a handout on that? I don't know. So this is the OSHA website. It's they follow the department label. And this is frequently cited OSHA standards. So you can search for that, or it's there's a through Z index right up here. Of course, now TSC's a state plan state is what we call it. So TOSHA has similar information, and you'll find, except for very recent information, you'll find for all the state plan states, it's accessible through the OSHA website as well. And so they do it by various ways that they sort stuff. So that's looking at construction there. It's frequently cited standards. Pulls out fall protection, hazard communication, scaffolding, respiratory protection, electrical powered industrial trucks, ladders. Those really don't change all that much, to tell you the truth. HAZCOM, I believe, has been one or two ever since it came into being. So I'm not, there's a couple of different lists out there. One, for example, is most frequently cited. That's just the number of times there's been a citation issued by a compliance officer. There's another one in there that does it by penalty, dollar amount. And so while HASCOM is usually 1 or 2 in frequency of citation. It's never even on the top 10 in financial penalty. So what are the things that will kill you in this list? Fall protection, scaffolding, ladders. I mean, there's other things that the penalties are assessed in proportion to the risk, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Topic 5. What do you say? You guys want to take 5? Okay. Take a bio break. Smoke any smokers? Yep. Okay, so take 10.
Take 10.
Yep. Some of the coatings on medication are cellulose esters, which Eastman does make, enteric coatings. Yeah. Okay, so how are inspections conducted? It authorizes CSHOs, that's safety and health officer, what's the C? Compliance, safety and health officer, conduct workplace inspections, and without advance notice, except in rare circumstances, imminent danger. Yeah, I've not heard that before, that if you tell an employer that an OSHA inspection is coming in advance, that you can be cited for that, so, or criminally cited for that. Has anybody ever been or an organization when they had an OSHA inspection? Where? And do you know why they came, or?
It was just general inspection.
Oh, was it?
I think they did Stitch it too one time when I was still when I was here also.
Yeah.
It was one of those where they said, well, we generally come around your industry X number of times and you overdue, so we decided to drop back.
Yeah.
There was nothing specific, but it was one of those where they just showed up.
There was a few times when I was at Eastman that we had inspections. We were a VPP site, so one of the components about VPP is that you really don't have, you're taken off the list for routine inspections. We had fatalities while I was there, and those obviously have an investigation. At Eastman Chemical. And then for VPP, they come in periodically to do that. I guess another one that occurred while I was there was as a result of an employee complaint. And it was actually not an Eastman employee, it was we had an on-site asbestos abatement contractor, and it was one of their employees complaining about their practices. But, since we owned the site, we were involved with it. So yeah, of course, they came here after the fatality and then came again, I don't know, I guess it was a little over a year later and did kind of like a verification that we had done the corrective actions that we committed to. Somebody asked here, was it last week, about what if OSHA shows up at 3 o'clock in the morning? I was in one of those,
Training sessions.
was it training or was it the oral boards, right?
No, well, I don't think it's all boards, but it was that same day.
And, you know, it's one of those where, I mean, you don't have to let them on site. You can make them get a warrant, but it's probably ill-advised.
Yeah, you had mentioned that it may have been that oral boards when you asked me what the response would be, and then we got in that big discussion.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah, so different types: imminent danger, fatalities, hospitalization, complaints or referrals, targeted, and these are things that they do on, I guess, on an annual basis. They'll have like special, they say local emphasis programs, national emphasis. Was it 2015? One of the national emphasis was fall protection and construction, which we participated in to a certain degree, and then follow-up inspections to go back and verify corrections. Typically, is what those are about.
There's particular hazards or industries, I don't know if that's where it falls, but the way it's explained to me is each type of industry goes into a specific category, and based on the average issues with those type of industries, that's how they'll schedule. They might come around quicker in Eastman's industry than they would have in Fulflex's industry, because based on
their is sort of a risk-based approach.
risk-based, yeah,
Yeah.
I believe that's how it may have been described.
Yeah,
And so therefore they came around, I don't know, maybe every 2 or 3 years over there based on the risk assessments, but you never knew when they were coming.
mhm.
And that was the targeted, I guess they call it targeted inspections, is what it fell under, but it's just based on the risk of that general group of manufacturing people, companies.
Yeah, and sometimes it'll be around a particular hazard. Like I know Tosha had, since I've been here, had an emphasis one year on carbon monoxide after they'd had several fatalities and near fatalities the year before for like operating generators and gas-fired generators inside buildings and, you know, just kind of crazy stuff.
So, with OSHA, what do they have for identification?
They'll have a ID card and badge.
Do we have it? And the only reason I'm asking is because we have an example of that. So somebody could have like a fake OSHA ID, because I've never seen them, show up at the gate and be like, hey, we're here for an inspection, and then you have access to this. So, I would have no way to compare that, like looking at a fake driver's license. I don't know. I'm asking for driver's license.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, I haven't seen one here in our archives or whatever, but I mean, typically we wouldn't give people access until they showed appropriate documentation, and then we would have, you know, management on site. When the state came back in, I guess I did some of the talking, then after the fatality, the return visit, I actually knew the person, so it wasn't an issue per se. But yeah, I mean, as far as false credentials, I don't know that there's any way you can determine that other than, you know, making a call or whatever.
So what is the process here? Is it enough that we can see their ID and then we go to the gate for them? Or will we have to call and confirm before we allow access?
we would most likely let them in and then call somebody from management to come to this, if it was off hours. If it's on hours, you know, they're gonna come grab me. And I know most of the OSHA folks in East Tennessee.
Does the company have the right to call OSHA headquarters or TOSHA headquarters in our case to confirm that those are the people here?
Sure, sure. Yeah, no problem with that. Again, the likelihood, and I haven't seen that figure floating around, but with the number of inspectors versus number of companies out there, it's like, you know, with everything sequential, it'd be like you get inspected once every 200 years or something like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of, you know, low risk facilities that we would never expect to be inspected unless they had a fatality or a
At my old job, we had a lot of injuries and stuff like that. I mean, fatalities would happen, but they wouldn't pronounce the person dead. Like, they would have them carried off-site to do that. So, you know, you go through training, they'll tell you, like, nobody's ever died in a shipyard. Obviously, it happens, but they don't pronounce them dead on the scene. But we had that happen, like, a lot, you know, a lot of injuries. Like, I don't recall during the summer, like, every morning, I always hear medical emergency every single morning. Because either somebody's fell down the stairs, passed out from heat exhaustion, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And I've never really seen, like, inspections or, like, anything like that come up. I mean, we have our own health and safety department, and, like, our own medical department and all that stuff, but I was just never experienced seeing, you know.
seeing an inspector come in. Now, shipyard, was that a federal, was that a government facility?
You know, we contract with the government, but they were private.
Was it GOCO, government-owned, contract operated?
We build carriers, but
Yeah.
so all of our stuff goes to them.
Yeah, I would guess that, and I don't know that facility in particular. I mean, I've been to some of the Navy facilities in Virginia, but like BAE, everybody know where the BAE plant is in Kingsport? British, anyway, it used to be Holston Defense. Actually, Eastman, when I started at Eastman was the contractor for the government, but it is what's called a GOCO facility, government-owned, contractor operated. So they produce explosives for DOD is all they do there. And there's probably one military person there, everybody else is. And those are sort of handled a little bit differently than, I mean, if it's federal workers, federal contracts, typically in a state, typically they'll be looked at and viewed a little bit differently. Those would probably be handled by federal OSHA, even though it's a state plan state. And then there's some carve outs for DOD from rules in terms of procedural rules. So that may have been part of why that occurred as it did on a shipyard.
We had the FRA that would do the negotiations. We had it's a week.
Oh, really?
And they wish they had them, I guess, at each location they would have one. That if there was a fatality or something, there would be more coming in. But we would have one about once a week would come in and check things out and stuff like that. But,
Yeah. I mean, I've been on military exercises where we had fatalities, and that was all handled within DOD. The OSHA folks never were involved with those. Penalty structure is on that particular one. Did I answer your question? Or I appreciate you sharing. I don't know. I don't feel compelled to answer things I don't know, but it's, you know, please feel free to share your experiences. We've all we all have them, and they're valuable. Penalties, the penalty structure, I should say, OSHA has its, and I tell you the truth, I don't think these have changed since 1970. Willful, 70,000, serious, 7,000, other than serious, 7,000, repeat, 70,000. In a general sense, OSHA citations are generally a lot less than you would probably expect them to be. Although some of them are getting substantial, for in the last decade or so. And there have been some instances, which is not probably in this presentation, but there have been instances of folks being held criminally negligent, executives. Massico, you guys, anybody follow that? Blankenship, Massico. So that was up here in Virginia. I think they're kind of like in the appeal process now, but Massey was the CEO, and he was actually criminally convicted of crimes, and it had to do with opposition to health and safety initiatives within the coal mine. So you see those every once in a while. They're fairly unusual, but it's another tool, I guess, they have at any federal agency, but they'll have to go get DOJ involved to make that happen. They don't have criminal citation authority on their own, so they have to get the Department of Justice involved to do that. And there's been talk forever about changing the penalty structure in OSHA, but to date it hasn't been. Okay. So questions? Example of why OSHA could conduct an inspection at your workplace. Anybody? Everybody? Fatality.
Reported injury.
Huh?
Reported injury.
Yep, injury. So those are kind of for cause. It could come in just unannounced as a general practice. Targeted inspections were talked about. Complaints, worker complaints. And what are the four categories of OSHA inspections, or citations, I should say, violations? They said that. Yeah, what type of OSHA violations? That second bullet. Mm-hmm.
They kind of follow along there because it's a right to work state, and a violation, I guess somebody might not know, but they would, contact OSHA about something and get rid of them because they don't have to give them a reason since it's a right to work state.
Yeah, and so there is that potential. Does everybody know what right to work state is? Anybody not? I mean, it's you don't in right to work states, you don't have to give an employee a reason for termination. You can terminate an employee with no explanation. Typically not done very often, to tell you the truth. I mean, of course, I've been, I guess Energy Solutions is one of the smaller organizations I've been employed by, deep pocket companies, and you guys had did you have some stuff by Kristen here recently about right to work, and labor law type stuff. I mean, you know, there's other implications, and even in a right to work state. I mean, you can bring action in a right to work state that's not necessarily based on what would be like EEO, for example. So there's other things that can kick in the right to work state. Let me see. You said, can it happen? Yeah, it can happen, and I'm sure it does happen, and I'm sure there's the employers who are going to do that probably aren't having a class like this, and probably aren't telling their employees that they have rights, and unless they know that on their own, you know, they might not have the knowledge to be able to even put in a complaint.
Like you see something that you think's unsafe and you refuse to do it, and they say, well, you know, just go home. And they don't really know that they could tie OSHA and say, hey, this is unsafe, you know.
Right. And so, yeah, this, you know, this, the outreach program of this type of thing, but, you know, also by you guys and through family members and others explaining what people's rights are in terms of employment. I mean, I think everybody should know that, but, you know, for example, how can you graduate from high school in Tennessee and not know that you have OSHA rights when you're employed? Oh, I don't know. Where can you go for help? Sources within the workplace work site, outside, inside, outside, and how do you file a complaint? So inside, who would you talk to if you thought we were doing something unsafe? Me? I'm Switzerland. Since I don't really supervise anybody. I mean, I'm a safe harbor, if you will. Supervisors, anybody on the management team, any supervisor. Actually, I would hope that we're to the point where it would be anybody, that anybody could tell anybody, and it would get attention and get action. That's to me, that's transparency. That's the ultimate of a safety culture, is you have so much transparency that there's never any thought of second thought about what you can do internally and outside. So folks who aren't here every day, where can you go for help? The whistleblower, internal company, the silent whistle. And of course, you can, you know, go to TOSHA officials that are local. I mean, I guess the closest one from here is in Kingsport. And then to file a complaint, how would you do that? I don't know that we talked about that in great detail, but does anybody know? Yeah. So there's an opportunity online on federal OSHA or state, and really don't worry about who has jurisdiction in that state, because if you go to the state and it's a federal state, then they'll kick it to feds and vice versa. If you did one online to OSHA and TOSHA had jurisdiction, they'll send it to TOSHA for them to act. Okay, so these are the answers, right? Employer, supervisor, coworker, union reps.
And this is not just for reporting, this is for information.
information, right?
Oh, this reader.
State safety data sheets, again, we've gone over that, but 3E website, 800 number, or supervisor, or come to me. I guess I would advise the latter only because I know how to get that stuff pretty quickly. Of course, labels and warning signs that on chemicals or other hazards like hearing protection and things like carbon monoxide that are sometimes generated within the facility. Yes, so manuals, federal rules, procedures, work tasks, work instructions, we call them as well. So all sources of information. Outside sources, the website, and then obviously it has a number for address, physical address for snail or for a phone call. You can telephone a complaint in, and the compliance assistant specialists in the area offices. Again, those are listed on TOSHA and OSHA websites, and then in the phone book as well. NIOSH, sister agency to OSHA, which is typically the research and education arm, which who does NIOSH fall under organizational, as you know? I'll give you a hint, they're in Atlanta. CDC. The head of NIOSH reports to CDC, through CDC, I should say. The Training Institute is an OSHA facility that is, I want to say it's in Michigan, but only OSHA Training Institute. And then there's local variants of that. There's a guy, there's that kind of a industry, I don't know what you call it, probably outreach activity at UT, for example. I mean, that does a fair amount of instruction. In fact, I'm going up first of next month to kind of watch a class on confined space rescue that this guy's doing at the UT Training Center. All kinds of resources there. I mean, the 10-hour training folks that are qualified to do the 10-30 hour are on a website as well. So doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, libraries, I guess today in the internet day, you can do about anything on your phone. How to raise a concern, handout 7. Somebody pull that open. I want to see what it. Okay, so this is a list of common hazards on both sides. So it can kind of, I guess, maybe spark a thought. I guess maybe a tidbit from my Eastman days when we used to go to the EU. One of the things they do in the EU in a work place evaluation thing is they actually look at stress levels and things, kind of what we consider more social, community, psychological type things. They actually look at those in the workplace. Discuss anyone who has discovered safety and/or health problems in the workplace. Any experience there? You mentioned one earlier, the benzene is a good but bad example of how things should not work. What's the biggest hazard here, do you think? People, relationships, stress. Crane. So loads, valves. Of course, the one I think we probably talk about more and think about more here is the nuclear component of it. In most instances, that's not really included here all that much, although there are some, parts of OSHA that touch on nuke, but most people who are licensed by the NRC, when OSHA comes in here, they don't typically look at that. That's handled by, other regulators.
We have a big issue with Portsmouth, and it's not something that they focus on, it's like a personal thing, but as far as physical fitness, we have numerous injuries every day, just based on the fact that people, when they would go to trip, they would be so overweight when they trip that they couldn't catch themselves and go down and bust their knee, because they were smoking too. So we had basically, we had 2,500 people on the site. We had actually probably half of us going to smoke every day. And almost all of our injuries came from like trips going into smoking.
CSX actually has a clause that they come out with. If you're 300 pounds or more, you cannot hop on a ladder.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Just because of
Hop on a ladder.
yeah.
So all these guys,
So here's something I put up here on during the break too. Anybody know what this is? This is a morphonym. Inoculate. Inoculate, an extra T as inoculate. So that's intravenous coffee. And also some of the gamish of different orgs that have pieces of health and safety or chemical or whatever you want to call it. Of course, we talked about OSHA, EPA, and the NRC. What's this one stand for? CPSC. Consumer Product Safety Commission. What do they regulate in terms of consumer products? Exactly. So some of the issues are lead in jewelry, kids' jewelry, and things of that nature. The phthalates in kids' toys a few years back was a pretty big deal. FDA, what in terms of chemicals do they regulate? Food, drugs, cosmetics. And so Underwriters Lab is a non-government organization that does their testing.
I just wondered if it would kind of be part of a consumer product.
They probably do. I mean, they do a lot of stuff with consumer products, especially with fire retardants and things of that nature. And then electrical products for safety, and especially like here we don't have it, but at Eastman, most of our manufacturing areas were, rated from a flammability standpoint. And so we never used electric tools over there. Everything was air driven so they wouldn't spark. Intrinsic safety. OSHA complaint. Again, we've covered this, I guess, ad nauseum. It can be done anonymously, I guess, is one of the main takeaways. Of course, I guess you have potentially an anonymous, couple of anonymous ways here as well. Silent whistle and the safety suggestion box if you choose not to identify yourself. But 8A, what's the?
And then the maritime.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. For each industry sector, I got you. Okay,
And that's when the handout, it just tells you describe each hazard and if it exists in as much detail as you can.
yeah,
And identify where they're found at the workplace. Basically what you said, who, what, when, where, why, in as much detail as you can give them.
yeah. Okay, so here's some review questions. And some of these we just went over. So resources available inside the company, resources outside the company. I'm not going to go these in that level of detail, but the summary slide. I'm presuming this is the last one. Is the last one in your handout? In your slide packet? Yeah. Anything we didn't cover that you in this session you have a question about? So this one's supposed to last 2 hours. It's close. So. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna pull the test out and rather than testing, we're gonna go around and just start with Jim. And it's in I think the last page in this, isn't it? And just, is that correct? Where is it? Is it separate?
Yeah, it's connected.
Okay. So, just start at number 1 and kind of a group review.
Okay, OSHA's mission is to that is B. Ensure the safety and health of American workers.
Okay.
The creation of OSHA provided this important advice for workers.
So safe and healthful workplace. Okay.
Who rights related to OSHA recording? Nomekeeping. Workers have the right to review. For me, that's what OSHA records for work.
Anybody disagree with that? Number 4.
You've got the right to review your own records or somebody else's. That's where you're gonna read that.
Okay, yeah.
During OSHA inspection, you had a right to talk to the inspector product.
So the right of workers to seek safety and health of the job, without further punishment is spelled out in the OSHA stuff.
It was in one of those topic areas. I don't know.
Section 11 is the non-retaliation component.
Okay, so that would be C then for that. Number 7. One of the main responsibilities employers have under OSHA is to provide training
Actually, logging boots are specifically excluded.
Like me. The OSHA standards for construction and general industry are also known as D. Construction DRL registers.
Remember those parts and stuff out 1910 and 1926?
Is it A?
It's in 26 and Parkinson's.
Oh, that's right, 1910.
And 1926 is construction.
What type of OSHA inspectors do they do that for serious harm to the operator?
And danger. I think it's D. So, okay.
I don't remember 3D, so.
Or until it's fixed, okay, yeah, that's.
No, I didn't see that.
That's correct.
So it's B.
D. Mhm.
If you feel that OSHA inspection is needed to get homes graded at your workplace, which is the best option? That would be.
Okay, 1026, so, take another 10.
Oh, good.
Hey, if you guys don't mind taking a name on that,
Let's turn it in.